On October 4th, 1912, 6 months after the Titanic disaster, a petition was filed in the District Court of the United States for the Southern District of New York by the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited. In this petition, the company, better known as the White Star Line, claimed exemption from liability as owner of the Titanic for the collision, the subsequent sinking and loss of said steamship, as the losses, damages, injuries, destruction, and fatalities resulting therefrom were occasioned and incurred without the privity or knowledge of the company, and that the company is not liable to any extent for any loss, damage, injury, destruction, or fatality, or for any claim whatsoever in any way resulting or arising from or growing out of said collision and sinking. This ironclad legal document was filed by the White Star Line because over $1 million in claims had already been made by survivors and victims' families, and they expected many more claims to come, and they would get about $16 million worth. But thanks to an old act of 1851, if the accident in question was literally not their fault, ship owners could limit their liability to the collective value of lost ticket fares, cargo, and whatever remained of the ship after the accident. In Titanic's case, that includes just 14 lifeboats. And to lower that amount just a little bit more, White Star even specifies in this petition that of the $85,000 that should be refunded in ticket fares, $2,650 will not be, because 712 passengers were technically delivered to New York as promised, and therefore they don't need to be refunded. So with the ticket fares, cargo, and 14 lifeboats put together, White Star Line was petitioning that they should only be obligated to pay about $91,000 worth of claims. While this petition will successfully protect the White Star Line and will withhold funds from those seeking them, it will provide a lot of value to us 100 years later, because where there is a legal battle, there are hearings. Where there are hearings, there's more of our favorite thing on Witness Titanic, testimony. So today, we will actually not be diving into the United States inquiry, as we have in every episode to this point, pretty much. It is through the hearings of the petition of the White Star Line for limitation of liability that we are able to call today's witness to the stand. Welcome, one and all, to another episode of the Witness Titanic Podcast, the first inquiry into the sinking of the RMS Titanic in over a century. My name is James Penca, your chairman of sorts, as I conduct interviews with witnesses of her great story, from modern Titanic experts to even the survivors of this infamous sinking. Along the way, I hope to bring us closer to Titanic, closer to her passengers and crew, and closer to what actually happened in April of 1912, so that we might all witness Titanic ourselves. Folks, welcome back to the inquiry. Before we call our next witness, I have a few bits of housekeeping to cover. First off, I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I have a TikTok now. I have never been on TikTok until this week, so I'm new. I don't know what I'm going to do with it necessarily. I'm definitely going to post all the highlights from our episodes. Maybe I'll do more. Let's see how familiar I can get with TikTok. So please follow me over there, join me over there, whatever it's called, and we'll see how that goes. If you're listening to this episode in the future, I hope I still have it. Go take a look. See if I do. It's at Witness Titanic Pod. Next bit of news, we have our birthday episode coming up, June 25th. It's actually my personal birthday, but it's also the birthday of our podcast. I posted my very first episode on my birthday last year, so the podcast is a year old. So what I'm doing, I'm going to have like a little special episode. I want to answer your questions. I want to hear what you've learned this year. I want to hear your corrections on things I messed up. There's a bunch of those. So I'll just go through them. So email me, witnesstitanic@gmail.com. Send me voice notes. I've got like 2 voice notes so far. They're very fun to hear, and they might not all be on the episode, but send me your voice notes. Tell me what you learned about Titanic this year, what you love about Titanic, and maybe you'll make it on the episode. So join us on June 25th for that. And folks, as always, like, rate, follow, subscribe, ring bells, leave reviews, whatever you can do. If you like this episode, if you like this podcast, I will be forever grateful. It does make or break these things. So if you can leave anything, rate, review, whatever, it's very helpful for me. And then, of course, as always, you can join our Patreon. Patrons have listened to this episode a week ago already. We're probably already talking about the next episode. They helped me pick this week's witness that you're about to hear from. So if that sounds fun to you, join us over there on Patreon. Links are all over the place. So in episodes 2 and 3 of Witness Titanic, we spoke with managing director of the White Star Line, first class passenger, and villain of most retellings of the Titanic story, J. Bruce Ismay. If you have not listened to those episodes, definitely go back and listen to them before you listen to this one. But you really all should know Ismay by this point. He's more commonly referred to as the owner of Titanic. He's often seen as the embodiment of White Star Line's overconfidence. He's blamed for the recklessness of Titanic's speed. He took a seat in a lifeboat when other men wouldn't, and he's therefore seen as a coward. But in those episodes, we looked deep into his testimony and let him speak for himself. We heard Ismay's account of the conception, construction, and sinking of Titanic, as well as his own defense of himself. He claimed he was just a passenger, nothing more. He said he didn't step on the bridge until after the iceberg collision, that he spent the entire sinking loading lifeboats and only left the ship when the second-to-last boat being launched with empty seats, and there were no women and children around to take them. He also told us what a terrible effect the sinking had had on his mental and physical health. Despite all of this, Bruce's name was, of course, ruined. His life's work was ruined. He would never fully recover. He would forever be portrayed as the villain and coward of the Titanic disaster in countless books, films, documentaries, etc. To this day, coward is his role in the great Titanic story. But in these episodes, I made my feelings very clear about Ismay and his behavior. In short, he has been made the villain, in my opinion, of the Titanic disaster for many reasons. It's easier to comprehend tragedy when we have someone to blame. It makes us feel safer knowing that there's no Bruce Ismays on our next adventure. But most of all, I think he is the villain of the story for storytelling purposes. Every great story needs an antagonist, and the iceberg doesn't have a handlebar mustache. If you are writing an article, a movie, making a documentary, putting together an exhibit, a YouTube video, a podcast even, you are telling a story. You are entertaining someone. You may even be selling this entertainment through a Patreon, for example. Well, Bruce Ismay is your money maker. You may have producers breathing down your neck over your big Titanic documentary, and they want to see good numbers from this one. Ismay is your ticket. And so in every retelling, almost every retelling of the Titanic disaster, he gets wheeled out there to be our punching bag because the truth is often boring. There's a lot of gray area, a lot of uncertainty. Things aren't always as black and white as a Hollywood script would like them to be. And that, my friends, does not sell. And do you know who knew that better than anyone? The news reporters on April 15th, 1912. You want to sell some papers? You need a bad guy. That practice has not changed, by the way. But at the end of the day, Ismay was just a passenger, technically. He was not in charge of Titanic's navigation, technically. He's one of the few on board who knows the ship is going down, but he stays on board until 2 a.m. anyway. Given what we know from the testimony, not those newspapers, not the movies, not the documentaries you've seen, not the tour guide at the exhibit, from the testimony of his fellow survivors, I just don't think we've seen enough to say that Bruce was to blame for the tragedy and therefore deserved to be labeled as a coward and therefore deserved to have his life ruined, or as people still call for every day, that he deserved to die on Titanic. He was just another human being with a family, with children, and so he got into Lifeboat C, just like I personally think almost every single person listening to this podcast probably would have. Now, I'm not saying he was a perfect person, a fully innocent person. There's even some examples out there of him being apparently a pretty cold guy, kind of hard to get along with and such. And generally, I dislike super wealthy people of any era, and I dislike capitalism very much. I'm a hippie like that, but that's literally a different story. Bruce is the villain if we're talking about how the shipping lines at the time were all super reckless in how they operated. And so shipping owners at the time were villains of the Titanic story. And capitalism is the villain of the Titanic story. It's the villain of most stories, in my opinion. But we are talking specifically about Bruce Ismay, the man on board Titanic, and how he should or should not have acted during the voyage and sinking. So this is generally how I feel about Bruce. I shared this back in those episodes, and people came into the comments of those episodes to tell me that I was incorrect and that he was a bad guy. Some even said, again, that he 100% deserved to die on April 15th, 1912. But if I'm in the episodes saying, I've read the testimony, I think he's unfairly blamed, and people are in the comments saying, no, he was the villain, he shouldn't have taken that seat in the lifeboat, what are all they looking at? What evidence do they have? Well, there is one story that will often be cited about Bruce that is the core of his villainous portrayal. You've probably heard about it, and it's this story that Ismay urged or ordered Captain Smith to increase Titanic's speed so they might break a record on her maiden voyage or arrive a day early and surprise the morning papers. Something that clearly puts blame on Bruce when they are unable to avoid the iceberg right ahead. If this story is true, I take it all back. Ismay is the villain. How dare he tell the captain what to do? How dare he be so reckless? This story appears in the 1997 James Cameron film. This portrayal appears in the Broadway musical even. It appears or is heavily suggested in almost every major adaptation of the Titanic story. But where does this idea of the owner of Titanic telling the captain what to do, where does that come from? Did Titanic's officers come forward and say he was doing this, which would clear their name, honestly? Did a few passengers hear him tell Captain Smith what to do? Was he seen on the bridge pointing fingers at the engine order telegraphs and raising his voice at the crew? Did the news reporters just make all this up? If a man is going to be blamed for the deaths of 1,496 people for 100 years, if we're literally going to call for his death in YouTube comments, I would hope that there's plenty of solid evidence. Wouldn't you? Today on Witness Titanic, we will look at the one example of somewhat solid evidence of this actually happening. But before we even get into this, I do have to raise one red flag about this source. I told you in the Ismay episodes that we need to proceed with caution with him because Bruce has every reason on earth to lie to us in his testimony. And I pointed out all the times that I felt like he was. For the first time on Witness Titanic, we're diving into the testimony of the aforementioned limitation of liability hearings, which took place 1 year after the sinking. So everything you are about to hear comes from a memory that is 1 year old. And as is human nature, we have to remember that there's a lot of room for error here. It's just how it goes. We forget things when a year goes by. Also, this witness is one of the individuals claiming part of that $1 million and then eventually $16 million from the White Star Line. They claimed they lost $4,000 worth of things when Titanic went down. So they do have a lot to gain. I don't necessarily mean that today's witness is untrustworthy by any means. I in fact, when I read the testimony, I find it very truthful. I find it, there's not much exaggeration going on. So I don't necessarily think that today's witness has as much of a reason to lie as Bruce. Bruce was literally defending his own life. This person might get $4,000 out of it, and they're already, kind of a wealthy person. So not a huge deal. But emotionally, that $4,000 might mean a lot more than it financially will. So just something we should keep in mind. So like with Bruce Ismay, we will proceed with caution today as well. So as the chairman of this inquiry, I will now call first-class passenger Mrs. Elizabeth Lines to come forward and take the stand. Mrs. Lines, please state your residence.
111 Quai d'Orsay, Paris.
You are a citizen of what country?
Of the United States.
Were you a passenger on the Titanic upon her fatal voyage?
I was.
With whom were you traveling at that time?
With my daughter, who was 17.
At what port did you embark?
Cherbourg.
What was the location of your cabin?
It was an outside stateroom, amidship, on D-deck.
And so now you have heard the first 6 questions of a total of 210 asked of Mrs. Elizabeth Lines at these hearings. A bit of additional info about Elizabeth that they don't really touch on. She was 50 years old at the time. She was a first-class passenger, of course, was born in Burlington, New Jersey. Mrs. Lines and her daughter were traveling to the United States aboard Titanic to attend her son's graduation from Dartmouth College, and their cabin was specifically D28, just a short walk from the first-class reception room. Now, Mrs. Lines was called to testify at these hearings for the same reason we call her to testify today. She witnessed something that would benefit our respective investigations. The men questioning her in 1913 waste no time, and neither shall we. We jump to question 17. During that voyage, did you at any time hear a conversation or conversations between Mr. Ismay and Captain Smith?
I heard a conversation on Saturday afternoon, the 13th of April.
Where was it that they were conversing?
In the corner of the lounge furthest from the dining room.
Where were you at the time you heard this conversation?
In the lounge, at a table very near.
When you use the word lounge, do you mean in each case the room marked as first-class reception room on this plan?
Yes.
During the time that this conversation that you have referred to occurred, was there any person sitting in a position to interfere with your view?
No.
Okay, so we have the setting of the most talked about pre-iceberg conversation on board Titanic. Now let's talk about the characters involved. Let's actually confirm something with Mrs. Lines that we may be taking for granted. Are we certain that the men she describes in this conversation are in fact Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay? Have our Titanic enthusiasts out there ever questioned this? I didn't until I really dove in here, but thankfully the liability hearing is quite thorough and for legal reasons needs to ask these questions, so she has asked plenty of them. At the time of the fatal voyage of the Titanic, did you know by sight or were you acquainted with Mr. Bruce Ismay?
Knew him by sight. I did not know him personally. My home was in New York City until 13 years ago. I had seen Mr. Bruce Ismay during his residence in New York prior to that 20 years ago. I recognized him when he came on the steamer, and I asked my table steward if that were not Mr. Bruce Ismay, and he told me yes, it was.
At the time of this voyage, did you know by sight or were you acquainted with Captain Smith, master of the Titanic?
I had never seen Captain Smith.
Did you get to know him by sight on this voyage?
He occupied the head table in the dining saloon, and I supposed he was Captain Smith. I asked my table steward if that were not Captain Smith, and was told he was.
So it sounds like she knows Bruce quite well. Smith, not so much. But what's worse, she is questioned further about what they were doing in the reception room that day. That throws quite a bit of doubt in her direction. I understood you to tell us that the two gentlemen had a table in front of them.
Yes.
And that they had coffee and liqueurs and cigars.
Yes.
You are quite clear about that.
Oh, yes.
You do not mean that one of them had coffee and liqueurs and cigars. You mean that they both had.
Yes.
Do you mind describing to me very concisely the personal appearance of the gentleman you have described as Captain Smith?
I do not think I can. He had a fine face and a white beard.
When you speak of this gentleman as having a white beard, do you mean no part of his face was shaven?
I am not sure.
Are you sure the gentleman you are speaking of had a beard?
I cannot answer that question.
You are quite sure, at any rate, that he drank liqueurs and that he smoked?
Yes, I am.
If it were a fact that Captain Smith was a teetotaler and did not smoke, that would rather point to the conclusion that the gentleman who was sitting there was not Captain Smith, would it not?
I could not tell you. I saw the gentlemen sitting there with their liqueurs. I saw the steward bring them as he came and asked me if I would have any. It was the steward to serve all those things. You know that is a customary thing on a steamship. It was no special order.
So this is something in her testimony that people will point to totally discredit Mrs. Lyons. And you may be expecting me to point out, wouldn't a captain not drink on a voyage? He's on duty all the time, certainly not in view of other passengers. And she can't even remember if he had a beard or what his beard looked like. Maybe this isn't Captain Smith at all. Well, I actually don't find this to be much of anything. The beard thing, it had been a year. She had seen a million photos of Smith in the papers by this point, so even if she knew that accurately, that wouldn't really mean anything. I also have a hard time remembering the hair color of actors on like favorite TV shows and stuff. I'm not good with details like that, so I'm not really that mad at her for not knowing this. And then also Smith drinking in the reception room. I don't think he was supposed to drink. Captains generally don't, but we don't know if the steward was dropping off whiskey for Bruce and then a non-alcoholic beverage for Captain Smith. For all we know, Smith never picked up the whiskey or whatever they were drinking, but he was just being polite, didn't want Bruce to drink alone. So that's just kind of the formality. Just give me a drink, but I won't touch on it. So this wouldn't hold up in a courtroom, and I'm trying to think of this in a pretty serious way. So I personally do not think the beard or the liquor thing has anything to do with this, so we'll kind of let that slide. Now, it is time to hear what we all came here to hear. What was the conversation that Mrs. Lyons overheard, and what incriminating evidence can she supply to us? Elizabeth Lyons answers 210 questions in her testimony. How many of those do you think actually address the conversation between Ismay and Smith? How many do you think provide evidence for Ismay's behavior? Excluding questions where she repeats herself, there are a whopping 10 answers that address the conversation between the men. And again, excluding repeats, only 2 of them provide direct quotes of what she remembers Bruce saying. The entirety of this discussion about the conversation, the entire question and answer portion of this testimony that concerns this very, very important conversation takes place between questions 41 and 65. So all is fair. I have decided to ask the witness to run through all 24 questions and answers, no editing, no cuts, just so you can hear her full recollection of this conversation in its entirety. When all 24 questions have been answered, we will go back and go through and discuss as we do. As a reminder, the following 24 questions and answers that you are about to hear represent the only real evidence out there, to the best of my knowledge, that show Ismay pushing Smith to go faster. Listen very closely. Are you able to state from your recollection the words that you heard spoken between Mr. Ismay and Captain Smith on that occasion?
We had had a very good run. At first I did not pay any attention to what they were saying. They were simply talking and I was occupied, and then my attention was arrested by hearing the day's run discussed, which I already knew had been a very good one in the preceding 24 hours. And I heard Mr. Ismay, it was Mr. Ismay who did the talking. I heard him give the length of the run, and I heard him say, well, we did better today than we did yesterday. We made a better run today than we did yesterday, and we will make a better run tomorrow. Things are working smoothly, the machinery is bearing the test, the boilers are working well. They went on discussing it, and then I heard him make the statement, we will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday.
In your last statement, Mrs. Lyons, were you giving the substance of the conversation or the exact words which were used?
I heard, "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday," in those words.
If there were any particular words spoken that you can remember, I should be glad to hear them.
Those words fixed themselves in my mind. "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday."
Do I understand you to say that the other things that you stated were the general substance of what you heard and not the exact things or words used?
No, I heard those statements.
What was said by Mr. Ismay as regards to the condition of the performances of the engines, machinery, and boilers?
He said they were doing well. They were bearing the extra pressure. The first day's run had been less. The second day's run had been a little greater. He said, "You see, they are standing the pressure. Everything is going well. The boilers are working well. We can do better tomorrow. We will make a better run tomorrow."
In speaking of standing the pressure well, Mr. Ismay was referring to the boilers, was he not?
Of the boilers, I gathered.
I understand that hitherto you have been stating what you heard Mr. Ismay say. Is that true?
Yes,
What, if anything, did you hear Captain Smith say?
I did not hear anything.
Did you hear the sound of his voice?
No.
Won't you describe as well as you can the tone and gesture of Mr. Ismay in this conversation?
It was very positive. One might almost say dictatorial. He asked no questions.
Mrs. Lyons, if you can recall anything else said at that conversation, either in words or in substance, please state it.
There was a great deal of repetition. I heard them discuss other steamers, but what I paid the most attention to was the Titanic's runs, and it was simply that Mr. Ismay repeated several times, "Captain, we have done so-and-so, and we have done so-and-so. Everything is working well." He seemed to dwell upon the fact, and it took quite a little time, and then finally I heard this very positive assertion, "We will beat the Olympic, and we will get into New York on Tuesday." But he asked no questions.
Did you hear anything said by Mr. Ismay that directly or indirectly sought information from Captain Smith as to the performances of the vessel or as to Captain Smith's opinion of what the vessel could fairly do?
No, I did not.
What would you say as to your ability to hear all that was said in an ordinary tone of voice between Captain Smith and Mr. Ismay in the positions in which they were and you were on that afternoon of Saturday?
It was quite possible, as during the latter part of the time there were very few people left in the lounge, and it was quiet.
You say it was possible for you to hear.
It was possible to hear ordinary conversation.
Do you recall any conversation on that occasion between Mr. Ismay and Captain Smith as to the performances of another vessel of the line?
No, excepting the comparison with the runs of the Olympic.
And what runs of the Olympic were they using as a comparison?
The trial trip.
Do you mean the maiden voyage?
Yes, the maiden voyage.
And what was the substance or the words, if you can give them, of the conversation as regards to the Olympic?
It was comparison, and that the Titanic was doing equally well, and they seemed to think a little more pressure could be put on the boilers and the speed increased so that the maiden trip of the Titanic would exceed the maiden trip of the Olympic in speed.
Mrs. Lyons, won't you explain just what you mean by your words, "they seemed to think"? I wish to exclude your own impressions and ask you merely what you heard said on that subject.
They stated the run of the Titanic was equal to the run of the Olympic. Mr. Ismay did the talking. I did not hear Captain Smith's voice. I saw him nod his head a few times.
Did he nod his head as to indicate assent or dissent?
Assent.
What was it that Mr. Ismay said from which you say you drew the impression that they seemed to think that the Titanic would beat the Olympic or that the Titanic compared well with the Olympic?
They made comparisons in numbers which I cannot repeat, the number of miles run in various days. Mr. Ismay gave the runs made on certain days by the Olympic on its maiden voyage and compared them with the runs made by the Titanic on the first days.
You have stated several times, Mrs. Lyons, that Mr. Ismay made assertions or statements as to what we would do, using the pronoun we. Did he use any other pronouns that you know of in this conversation?
No, Mr. Ismay said we, and he asked no questions. He made assertions, he made statements. I did not hear him defer to Captain Smith at all.
Was there any part of that conversation that indicated whether or not Captain Smith deferred to Mr. Ismay?
No.
Did you leave the reception room or lounge where this conversation occurred before Mr. Ismay and Captain Smith, or was it the reverse?
They left the reception room.
What was the end of the conversation, as far as you can remember hearing it?
Come on, Captain, we will get somebody and go down to the squash courts.
Okay, first reaction. What do we think? Was Ismay telling Smith to go faster? Was he bullying him, pressuring him? Do you think this testimony proves anything either direction? Let's dive a little deeper. Let's first address Mrs. Lyne's impression on Bruce's demeanor. Not really what he said, but how he said it. In answer 41, she said it was Mr. Ismay who did the talking. In answer 48, she said she did not hear Smith say anything. She did not hear the sound of his voice. She only saw him nod. This is a bit concerning to me, I would say. Was Smith really not talking the entire time that she was sitting there? Or was she too far away to clearly hear both sides of the conversation? In which case, did she hear everything that Bruce said crystal clear? It's not a deal breaker for me, but it's a little odd. In answer 50, she said he was very positive. One might almost say dictatorial. He asked no questions. In answer 62, she said he made assertions, he made statements, and did not defer to Captain Smith at all. But when she's asked if Smith deferred to Ismay, she also says he didn't either, so I don't really know what to make of that. That's kind of a wash for me. The only thing I think we can pull from this, from his demeanor, is that Ismay was almost dictatorial, made statements and assertions. Now let's look at what he said. Answers 44 and 51 assure us that it was possible to hear these statements and that these statements are not general ideas of what, like she remembers this is what he said 1 year after the actual conversation took place. I will hope that she wrote these down, but let's assume that she remembered it exactly, and so this is what she heard. Now, did you listen carefully to every single word that Ismay said, like the direct quotes? Because that's super valuable. We don't often get in quotations, a direct quote of a person on Titanic from another person. This is juicy stuff. As a bit of an experiment, I will read every single direct quote that we got from Elizabeth, and I'll read it in the most dictatorial, assertive way possible. I won't ask any questions. I'll read them all as Bruce Ismay villain as I can. And we will see what it makes us think. Like, if we assume the worst, what does it sound like? Let's try it. We had a very good run. Well, we did better today than we did yesterday. We made a better run today than we did yesterday. We will make a better run tomorrow. Things are working smoothly. The machinery is bearing the test. The boilers are working well. We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday. You see, they are standing the pressure. Captain, we have done so-and-so. We have done so-and-so. Everything is working well. Come on, Captain. We will get somebody and go down to the squash courts. There you go. That's my Bruce Ismay with an American accent, because no, I'm not gonna do a British accent. But you get the idea. Trying to be as dictatorial as possible. So my question to you, hearing these statements, the only statements that we have that show Ismay telling Smith anything about the ship, speed, and whatnot, hearing them in this assertive way, do you hear a man telling his captain what to do? Or is there a chance that you're hearing a man who is just super excited about how fast his new toy boat goes? That's always kind of been my vibe on Bruce in this situation. When people say, well, Bruce was telling passengers all over the ship how fast the ship was going to go. And there are other people aside from Elizabeth Lyons. I think John Thayer had a conversation. Emily Ryerson had a conversation. Others had conversations where Bruce talked about the speed of the ship very proudly, very, very proudly. And to me, is that Mr. Dictator? I think it's literally just a guy who's literally on his toy boat, and he's just super into it. And that's me trying to paint him in the worst light possible. In the best light possible, he's just proud of his father's company. He took over for his father, Thomas, and look at what I've done with it. I don't have an issue with that. But painting him in the worst light possible, he's just a rich kid with a new toy boat. That's kind of how I've always described it. But do you hear him telling Captain Smith what to do in that conversation? The most incriminating thing he says is, "We will do better tomorrow," or "We will beat the Olympic." But this isn't exactly news to Smith. As Ismay told us in episode 2 of this podcast, go back and listen to it, and it's confirmed elsewhere, this isn't just Ismay, they were warming up the engines as you usually do on a first crossing. They were not running at full speed when they hit the iceberg the day after this conversation took place, but they aimed to run her at full speed in the following days had the disaster not eventuated, I think is the word he used. So Ismay saying we will do better tomorrow and we will beat the Olympic is at best just an optimistic statement of an excited business owner. And it's at worst, it's just him telling the captain what he already knows. But to play devil's advocate, it is possible, just being honest, it is possible that when he said this, Ismay was looking Smith dead into his soul and said, "We will do better tomorrow. We will beat Olympic." Essentially threatening him like he's a member of the mafia. That is technically possible, that is what she was witnessing and how she's describing dictatorial. It is possible. And Ismay did tell us in his episode that there was no reason to get into New York a day early, which after hearing this testimony clearly sounds like a lie. He obviously wanted to beat Olympic's record, and then after the sinking, he suddenly isn't interested in the record. Certainly, Ismay was lying in his testimony. Not a good look for him. But does any of this prove he pushed Captain Smith to go faster? Not in my book. For me, folks, there is only one answer in this testimony, one answer in the entire Titanic library of testimony that could be considered solid evidence against Ismay at first glance. Listen closely again to answer 58.
And they seemed to think a little more pressure could be put on the boilers and the speed increased so that the maiden trip of the Titanic would exceed the maiden trip of the Olympic in speed.
There is your smoking gun. They seem to think a little more pressure could be put on the boilers and the speed increased. Is that so? That's really interesting, because that's not what she has been saying at all to this point. In fact, answer 58 is the only answer in her entire testimony where she says the word speed or the word increased. In the other 209 answers, she's only describing Ismay as stating we are making good time and we will do better tomorrow. And she gets called out for it, for making this sudden jump. They ask her to exclude her own impressions and state only what she heard. So she corrects herself. And her new response is, they stated the run of the Titanic was equal to the run of the Olympic. All this to say, folks, 210 answers. 24 concern Ismay's behavior, 4 contain direct quotes, and only 1 mentions the speed being increased to break a record, and she immediately has to rescind that answer. Yet, that is the answer that we have pointed to for 100 years as evidence against Bruce Ismay. What you are left with, in my opinion, is a year-old memory about a potentially unlikable and untrustworthy man, liar, person, talking about Titanic's successful day's run during a voyage where the ship's run was so often talked about that passengers literally bet on it. If you look at what Ismay actually said, even if he was dictatorial as he said it. You could put those words in any passenger's mouth on any ship on their maiden voyage, and nobody would bat an eye. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Let's hit the squash court. He doesn't say anything in this testimony. The only thing is the captain is sitting next to him. Maybe. Speaking of maybe Captain Smith, we're going to ask Mrs. Lyons one more question. She's clearly not 100% sure she saw Captain Smith. The fact that they were drinking isn't helpful. The fact that she never heard him speak isn't helpful. I already said I don't want to include these as like anything serious against Elizabeth, but there is one more thing that we hear in her testimony that actually makes me think more than ever, was this really even Captain Smith in this conversation at all? Elizabeth tells us when this conversation took place.
I passed through the lounge after luncheon to my stateroom, and the captain and Mr. Ismay were sitting there. I passed through the lounge again to go to the elevator and go up on deck from my stateroom. They were there. I went 2 or 3 times all the way round the deck and came down to my stateroom. They were still there. I remained in my stateroom reading for perhaps half an hour or 3/4 of an hour and went out into the lounge to get a cup of tea, and the captain and Mr. Ismay were just leaving it. That is what I saw.
And as they left, after what she describes as a couple hours in the reception room, Captain Smith is off to the squash courts with Bruce Ismay. Highly, highly questionable. It seems a bit unreasonable to assume that that's Captain Smith. But again, it's not like great evidence, so I don't necessarily want to, put my life on the line for that. But it's just all these things start to add up a little bit. So now you know what Elizabeth Lyons actually heard, not what a documentary told you she heard. Throw my opinion out the window if you would like. I really don't mind. But now you know what she actually said. You can form your own opinion if you need to. Was Ismay 100% innocent? Of course not. Did he lie in his testimony? Oh, yes. Was Elizabeth Lyons lying? With $4,000 on the line and a bit of an emotional thing to prove, maybe. Is there enough evidence here to say Ismay pushed Smith to go faster? No. Is there enough evidence to say that Ismay had anything to do with the iceberg collision? Not really. Not as a passenger on board Titanic, at least. Is there enough evidence here to say that Ismay deserved to have his life ruined or that he deserved to die? 100% no. There is less evidence saying Ismay told Captain Smith to go faster than there is evidence that this wasn't even Captain Smith in the reception room at all. This testimony proves that Ismay was talking about how well Titanic was running. Unfortunately, that's about all it proves. But the newspapers, documentaries, exhibits, YouTube videos, and podcasts, and everything have taken these 24 questions and ran with them. This conversation even appears in the 1997 James Cameron film. You may recall this great scene, very well acted from both actors, where Ismay tells Smith that the maiden voyage of Titanic must make headlines. Retire with a bang, A.E.J. Great stuff. Well, you all know I'm a huge fan of James Cameron's many historic Easter eggs in this film, and this may be the most subtle and easy to miss. But next time you watch this scene, keep an eye on the woman sitting behind them. She glances up at them while they're talking. She's clearly overhearing. This is clearly our witness, Elizabeth Lyons. But one thing I find fascinating about the script of this scene, you'll notice that Ismay is pushing Smith to light more boilers and pick up the speed, as he always is in these movies. But on paper, he never actually tells Smith what to do. He only says, I want you to do this, but I'll leave it to you, but wouldn't it be great? And it's through his demeanor that he is telling Smith what to do. We can all see that he's telling Smith what to do, but he never technically does. So if Elizabeth Lyons overheard this much more incriminating version of the conversation, I still think it wouldn't prove anything. With the sole exception of the ending of the scene, the Ismay character finishes the scene by saying, "Good man." That's Ismay acknowledging that he has told Smith what to do and Smith is relenting. But what's interesting, I checked the original draft of the 1997 screenplay, and that line is not in the scene. So James Cameron originally wrote this scene to be a bit more ambiguous, to not fully paint Ismay as the villain of the story. But at some point between the writing of the script and the filming of the scene, he or a producer felt it would be better for the story if the scene ended with a truly black and white villainous line, "Good man." Ismay was a complicated fella. He was a cog in the capitalist machine that resulted in the deaths of 1,496 people. He was a wealthy man, contributing to the wealth inequality surpassed only by the inequality that we see today. Ismay may very well have been a terrible, terrible person. But did Elizabeth Lynes hear Bruce Ismay tell Captain Smith to increase Titanic's speed, and therefore deserve the blame for the disaster, and therefore deserve to have his life ruined or ended? No. And the truth matters. Evidence matters. Due process matters. Innocent until proven guilty matters. Without these things, we can all just accuse people we don't like of whatever we want, whatever makes the story better for us. On the flip side of that, however, it's the same legal approach that I'm describing that protected the White Star Line and Bruce Ismay from paying no more than $90,000 to survivors and victims' families, which is obviously a shame. But on the flip side of that, you'll be happy to know the White Star Line did end up settling out of court and paid about $600,000 to the claimants anyway. Once again, history just refusing to be black and white. I will leave it up to you to decide who the villain of all of this really is. So let me know in the comments what you think. Who do you think the villain is and why? Here's a hint: it's greed and capitalism and all those things, mixed with recklessness and bad luck. It's a lot of stuff. We've talked about it, and we've got so much more to talk about, but we have so much testimony to get through, so we got plenty of time to talk about it. But let me know in the comments what you honestly think. Did the testimony change your mind at all now that you actually heard what she heard? I'd like to thank my partner, Katie Johantgen, for providing the voice of Elizabeth Lynes. She was last with us when she provided the voice of Ella White. We don't get to hear from women very much from the Titanic disaster because they were not asked for their opinion very much. So it's very fun whenever we get to have Katie involved. So Katie, if you can hear me, thank you for helping. And then also David Nonini. David works with us at Titanic Honor and Glory, great researcher. Earlier today, I was just having doubts about some of the things I was putting in this episode, and we talked it out. He found some research for me and made me feel a little better. So thank you, David, for your help. Witness tier patrons, keep an eye out for your bonus testimony from Mrs. Lynes. She provided 12 answers out of her 210 answers regarding her experience with the iceberg collision and the sinking, like what it was like for her. We will cover that pretty quickly, and I'll ask Katie to say hello to you all. Everyone else, I will see you next week for our birthday episode. Be kind to each other, Titanic community. I hope you enjoyed this episode. My name is James Penca, your fake chairman. I will see you when we reconvene. Bye.